Hello and welcome back to SiGMA TV. Our return guest, ladies and gentlemen, is Alidad Tash, definitely one of the crowd favorites here in the show. He's the managing director at 28 Limited, a Hong Kong-based consultancy specializing in casinos and integrated resorts around the world. Alidad has held senior-level positions with gaming companies in Las Vegas and Macau since 2000. It's great to have you back, Alidad. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year to you. Hopefully things are going well where you're at.
All is well, Alidad, and it's been a while since we spoke, and a lot of crazy stuff had happened in the past couple of months, hence the delay in our interview. So could you recap the interesting year for Macau in 2021, and why not we start with COVID first?
In terms of COVID, Macau remains one of the safest places in the world. Since 2 years ago, when COVID started, January 2020, Macau has registered a total of 80 total COVID cases, of which less than half have actually entered Macau. The rest have been caught at the border or sitting in some kind of a hospital. So Macau remains extremely safe. Unfortunately, part of the reason that we are so safe is that the number of visitors coming into Macau has been severely curtailed. And that's because with the exception of mainland China, which does produce a significant portion of its visitors, even before the pandemic, the only country in the world is mainland China, where people can go in and out without having to quarantine. Every other place in the world, from Hong Kong and Taiwan, requiring a 2-week quarantine in a hotel, and not really fancy one, deliberately a pretty unattractive, unpleasant hotel. Up to 3 weeks for most places around the world, you need to do a 3-week quarantine in that hotel, plus a 1 week after that in your home. And recently they bumped up the quarantine to 4 weeks for some countries, in addition to the 1 week at home. So effectively, if you come from certain countries, we're talking about 5 weeks where you can't get anything done. You're stuck either in the hotel or at home before you can actually go and conduct businesses or go anywhere else in Macau. This is all done in order to dissuade people from going abroad, catching it, and coming back and infecting the community. But it has some of its consequences. Is that Macau is not doing so good financially. One more thing in terms of vaccination, Macau is at 70% at full vaccination and 75% partial vaccination. But what makes Macau unusual, I think Macau and Hong Kong are the only two regions I've heard of, is that unlike most of the places in the world, where even those with anti-vaxxers, most older people around the world are the most highly vaccinated. In Macau, it's the other way around. If you're 70, 80 years old, you're far less likely to be vaccinated, something in the tune of 25, maybe 20%. Which is very unusual because everywhere else in the world, we're talking about 75, 80, 85%. So the young people here are carrying, yeah, it's very unusual. The young people are carrying the burden of being vaccinated as the older people feeling no threats. No death has been reported in Macau because of COVID. Again, total of 80 cases, less than 40 in the community. So they feel very safe. And for them, the choice is between vaccine and a virus. That's not the case. For them, it's just a matter of, they'd rather just have nothing and have no threat and having Macau remain closed, which is obviously having its effect on Macau's economy.
Great. So Macau still stands as one of the safest countries in the world. Alidad, I want to touch upon two really big items that negatively affected the stock market in September and in November. Could you tell us more about that?
Sure. There's 6 gaming companies in Macau. They have 20-year gaming licenses, and they're all going to expire at the end of June. People have been anticipating, actually waiting for some kind of a direction from the government. Unfortunately, there was a document that was sent out late night, some night in September, and it caused more confusion and panic than anything else. In it, with the exception of the usual, make sure you treat employees nice and be Macau nice and have more non-gaming than gaming. In addition to these obvious ones, it included a couple of provisions that were kind of strange. And were somewhat misinterpreted, somewhat deliberately, and maybe because people were not aware. I think it was a combination of some people wanting to manipulate the stock. They kind of made it sound far worse than it is. But basically, the two questionable items were, one of them is that the government is going to require the governments, the gaming companies, sorry, to seek its permission before issuing dividends, which is highly unusual. Dividends is something done in a it's in a capitalistic society. It's done basically between the people and the shareholders. And yet the government wanting to interfere kind of threw some people off, and it was kind of scary. And we have yet to kind of get clarification. The government's still asking for opinion, or did ask for opinion, and is going to come back with what they're going to go do as to the set of rules. And the other one was that they were going to go and install a person, a government liaison or a government employee operating free will within each of these casinos, which also sent shivers down a lot of people's back, because we kind of, in the beginning, it could have been misinterpreted to be, do they have to go and run the show, or are they just kind of mere observers? What is the degree by which these people are going to participate? That was somewhat clarified, but not quite there yet. So these guidelines that were issued in September, plus one more curious phrase that there will be no more sub-concessions, that also threw market into a panic, because there's 3 concessions and 3 sub-concessions, and some people, unaware of how they're set up and whether they're foreign or whether they're Chinese companies, they misinterpret it as though, oh, the foreign companies must be the sub-concessionaires and they're going away. But that's not the case. That was a mistake. Of the 3 sub-concessions, which are, again, in name only, they just have the word sub in front of them. There's no other difference about them. And it's a long historical, we're not going to get into that history lesson. But basically, 2 of them are American, 1 of them is Chinese. That was not the intention. The interpretation, I think the correct interpretation of most people was that, oh, there are going to be 3 concessions and 3 sub-concessions today are going to become 6 concessions in the future. But some people misinterpret it as though, oh my God, the American companies are going to be pushed out. And as a result, like you said, there was a panic, and overnight, we had a 30% decline in the company's values. I mean, think about this. 1/3 of the values of the collective 6 companies' stocks was wiped out overnight. There's been some recovery since, but definitely not back to the original level. Yes, and then after this somewhat government going back and saying, no, we're going to clarify everything else, give us some more time, there was the shock of all shocks, which is the head of one of the largest junkets in Macau, the largest junkets in Macau, Sun City, was on a Friday, a warrant of arrest was issued for him in a province in China, or an intention to arrest. And then mysteriously, coincidentally, and double quotes, within 24 hours, the Macau government also found him guilty of some other charges. So instead of him being extradited, has been held in prison in Macau, in jail in Macau, since awaiting his trial.
What were the crimes that were committed by Alvin Chow?
Well, let me just kind of explain. A junket is basically a middleman that goes and solicits players from mainland China mostly, and says, hey, here's some money. They go and negotiate on behalf of these players with a casino and get favorable rates. They get large commissions. A typical gaming company, out of $100 you win, $39 of it goes to government taxes. On top of the 39, these junkets could go and yield as much as another 42% commission. So that's an unbelievable amount was exacted by these guys by virtue of them bringing players. But in reality, they circumvented the law by not just bringing players over here, but also facilitating them breaking the law by bringing into Macau more than $50,000 US, which is the annual limit of a typical Chinese citizen out of China for a whole year. So a Chinese person can only bring 50,000 US out of the country for a whole year for whatever reason, medical, tuition, tourism, gambling. And these guys would go and give these guys far above that number, such that a typical gambler making bets of 250,000 US a hand every single time you played a hand, and they're making 30, 40 hands an hour, they were violating the law by going and exceeding the capital by 50,000. That's one way they brought players over and they violated the law. Another way is that they went and actively pushed these players to come and gamble, and soliciting gambling is already illegal in mainland China. Another thing they did is they engaged in online gaming, which is not available in Macau, but is available throughout Asia, especially in Philippines, Cambodia. And that is definitely a scary thing to the authorities in China, because that's a national security issue. Let me give you a perspective as to the quantum for what we were talking about. Las Vegas made something around $6.5 billion in winnings last year, in a pre-pandemic year, 2019. Macau made something like 36 billion. The estimate amount of gambling in China for 1 year exceeds $160 billion, almost 5.5 times what Las Vegas is. And that is just mostly done by the junkets. So these junkets were repeatedly warned. They didn't listen, and eventually the head of the largest one, Sun City, happens to be in jail awaiting a trial and obviously some long sentences. So these two also freaked the market out, such that most places in the world, they recovered from a very nasty March 2020 stock drop. Most industries in the world will suffer because that's when COVID hit the world, Europe, US. The casinos are probably one of the very few, maybe with the exception of travel industry, that have yet to recover. Everything else, technology, so many other industries have actually recovered. Macau is still suffering, and Macau stocks are still suffering because they have been affected by these two pretty scary pieces of news.
So Alidad, what is the long-term implications of the extinction of junkets then for Macau?
Oh yeah, so you kind of mentioned, so since that arrest in late November, junkets, whether or not they wanted to be legal or not, the casino companies basically said, thank you, we don't want you anymore. So as of now, three of the three American companies and one Chinese, Melco, have actually said, we do not have junkets in our casinos anymore. Not just Sun City, but anybody. There's a couple of question marks as to whether or not Galaxy and SJM, the two remaining Chinese companies, are actually allowing junkets to be played in their casinos, and if so, for how much longer. But they saw the handwriting on the wall, and as a result, 30% of the gaming revenue has been wiped out. Now, let's be clear. The amount of revenue that the amount of a bottom line, EBITDA, net profit that these generate is not nearly as much as the other segments. But again, it's still positive revenue for the government because they collect taxes on it, and it's still positive profit that has just gone away, and that's another 30% burden, which is going to make the recovery even worse, even more difficult.
And last year, Alidad, Las Vegas is having all-time highs in summer. Why is that? Why is Las Vegas having an amazing year compared to Macau?
Yeah, well, it all depends on the values of the country. In Macau, in China, and in Hong Kong, they still deployed one of the few remaining places in the world that they deployed what's called zero COVID, which means they want to go after every single COVID case, lock it down until it dies out. As a result, they put personal safety and security and safety from this COVID above any financial security. In the West, not just the US, but also many places in Europe, they say it's based on personal choice. So they do not, if you have COVID, okay, go home or be hospitalized. It's kind of up to you to wear a mask or not wear a mask. That is something that does not play in Asia, that does not play in Macau, does not play in China. So I'm not here to question the philosophy. It is just the way that Macau has decided to handle it, basically saying personal lives are more important than financials. In the West, it's the opposite. Financials, and you take care of your own. That is why Las Vegas, since the spring of last year, is having record-breaking month. Not just records in the last couple of years, but all-time records have been set in Las Vegas. Macau is having a very, very difficult time. It's doing far lower than what it did in pre-pandemic 2017, 18, 19. And we continue to suffer financially. But we have the freedom to be free from COVID. Is there a happy medium there? Perhaps if the vaccination rate would be a bit more aggressive. China has vaccinated people in the 83% fully and 87% partially. Macau is at 70 full and 75%. Perhaps that number could be pushed up through a more aggressive government effort, something that Hong Kong said is going to try this coming February. Perhaps that would get us to the magical 80% mark that the government has indicated will open up borders, perhaps to Hong Kong, maybe some other countries. So we're kind of sitting there waiting for that final 5 to 10%, and a little bit more push from the government is the wisest, because vaccination is clearly the best, most preventative way we can have COVID, in which case we would be able to open the borders, and the small and medium businesses, which have been suffering significantly, are going to basically find a lifeline.
All right, so what do you foresee in 2022 for Macau in terms of concessions?
Oh, well, the concessions are due they're going to expire at the end of June, but the government has indicated that it's going to go ahead and give an answer much sooner. Ideally, they have all the way till the end of April to actually get something, to mid to late April. I believe the government's going to move much faster. I think sometimes in February, maybe March, the government's going to go and make a decision. As to the decision, forgetting that dividend and that clarification, there's really two questions. Who are the six players? Who are the players? Are there going to be 6 licenses like the last 20 years? Or are there going to be fewer or perhaps more? I think most analysts believe that the current 6, the 3 Americans and the 3 Chinese, will retain their current licensing, although newer rules, more restrictions. I think that's most likely the likely scenario. And the other one is the length of the contract, the license. The 20-year license is very long compared to some other jurisdictions around the world. So I'm of the opinion that 10 years, 5 to 10 years, and I'm with the majority here, that I think 10 years is more reasonable, or more likely, not reasonable, because the government wants to shorten the leash by which it could go and exert control over these gaming companies, but also not make it so cumbersome that every few years you have to go and renew. So I think a happy medium would be 10 years. Other people are arguing for the same 20, for crazy numbers above that. I simply do not think that's the case. And again, we'll find out within the next, sometime this quarter. Those are really the 2 big ones. Obviously, we're going to have the same, make sure you have more locals, be nice to local and employees, have more non-gaming. That's always been the tune. It's kind of like world peace, who's against that? The question is, I think those are the 2 big ones. The one other thing that has not been discussed in these guidelines is the possibility of increasing the gaming taxes. I happen to be one of the minority who thinks that it is quite possible that the government might actually increase this current 39% tax to be able to, or ask for a significant gaming concession fee, whether it's paid annually, every other year, or within the first 5 years, 10 years, some kind of a fee. But it just basically needs to make up its shortfall, because the revenues in Macau were down significantly over 2 years ago. Not just last year, but even the year before that. So the government needs to make up that shortfall. And I think that's the easiest way. Every 20 years, you get a gift, something called a concession, and this is the perfect timing for the government to act on it.
Alidad, so I want to wrap this up, just being respectful of your time. Now, based on your projections, what do you project in terms of gaming revenue and visitation in 2022?
Well, let's go back to what happened over the last couple of years. In 2019, Macau made $36.5 billion. In 2020, it made 1/5 of that, only 20%. Last year, 2021 started fantastic. Vaccines were coming back. Life was going back to normal, what people hoped. But despite all that, Macau made only 30%, just under 30% of what it did in 2019. So things were pretty grim. 20% and 30% of what you did a couple of years back does not look very promising. So that said, if I was going to go make a projection, and also don't forget, the last month, we also lost the potential of Junkets returning. So if you want to talk in terms of revenue, and that was what your initial question was, in terms of revenue, the Junkets are unlikely to ever make a comeback, or it will be very, very, very small. So that 30% is already gone. So you're asking for anything that's non-junket to make up the loss of their own plus the loss of the Junkets. That won't happen for another 4 or 5 years, 24, 2025, 2026. I think this year, a reasonable assumption, 22 years ago, 30 last year, I think a reasonable mid-40s is possible. I think climbing to somewhere between 40 to 50% of the revenue from 2 years ago would be a significant improvement, given the fact that there is not that much of a momentum or likelihood for Macau opening up further to Hong Kong, its closest neighbor, besides mainland China. And if that's the case, it's going to take months, probably second half of the year, before Macau gradually opens. So 40s is my estimate. As to whether the stock market is going to be affected, I think the stock market looks for a lack of uncertainty, and hopefully within the next 2-3 months, the government will much more clear guidelines as to what's going to happen with the concessions. That's going to go and allay a lot of the fears. Then people can start investing in these companies, with half of them are American. And so it's really basically two questions. What's going to happen with the gaming concessions, which I think we're going to get some reasonable news, nothing surprise, no surprise coming. And I think once the gradual opening happens, things are going to start looking better for Macau. But we're looking at a years-long recovery. It will not be like Vegas, where just shot up within a year and a half of the pandemic.
Well, very interesting points, Alidad. I think we have covered a lot in Macau, and I think there's a lot to unpack here for people to take in. I sincerely enjoyed this conversation. We'd love to have you keep coming back here on the show. You've made an invaluable contribution to our viewers throughout the past couple of years, and we sincerely appreciate you, so thank you very much.
Sure. Thank you very much.
That is it for myself and Alidad. Join us in the conversation in the comment section below. And if you wish to see more videos like this, please be sure to subscribe to the channel, and we hope to see you in the next one.